According to reports coming out of the JMA Network Open, that is the Journal of American Medical Association, the Washington Post, and the New York Times, among others, young adults, especially men, are having sex less frequently. A U.S. General Survey reveals more women are dissatisfied sexually with their male partners. Misguided pundits blame the problem on everything from social media, cell phones, the economy, and apps. They attribute the phenomenon to everything but the obvious, a culture that is increasingly devoted to deriding manliness, demeaning manhood, and that constitutively defines masculinity as toxic. A culture where the virtues of manhood, such as the natural desire to lead, to protect, to leave a legacy, to be confident and decisive, are condemned as patriarchal and obsessive. Ours is a culture that socializes young boys to despise, live in ambivalence towards, and regard their penises with deep suspicion, guilt, and shame. Their sexual self-esteem is assaulted on several fronts. Historically, radical man-hating feminists have fostered philosophies and attitudes in our society to turn the culture against manhood. And to a large extent, these women were regarded really as freakish miscreants. And apart from lesbian separatists and a minority of man-hating women, most women regarded them as freaks, because most women then and now love real men. But what if there is a relatively accelerating ideology, a pervasive one suffusing our society with idea pathogens at an unprecedented rate that results in not just the emasculation of men, but their annihilation? An ideology that would fulfill the dream and calling of feminist Mary Daly, who wrote, quote, "If life is to survive on this planet, there must be a decontamination of the earth. I think this will be accompanied by an evolutionary process that will result in a drastic reduction of the males." Close quote. Here I'm talking about transgender ideology, a widespread belief system that has taken root in the thought processes of millions of young Americans. Consider this: gender dysphoria, an extremely rare disorder in which one feels a very deep conflict between one's biologically assigned sex and the gender identity identified with it, affected only 0.6% of the population up to 3 years ago. Today, teenagers and adults under 25 make up 43% of the trans population, according to the Williams Institute, a research center at the University of California in Los Angeles that produces highly regarded reports on demographics, behaviors, and policy concerns of the LGBT populations in the USA. Now, the study found that people in the 13 to 25 age group accounted for a disproportionately larger share of the trans population. Those in the 18 to 24 age group constitute 11% of our total population, but 24% of the trans population. Something is happening in America. Is this a genuine case of people authentically experiencing gender dysphoria? Or is there something much more sinister taking place? How in particular are young heterosexual boys at risk for being irreversibly damaged by transgender ideology? Is mainstream society justified in its fears of the consequences of the ideology? Finally, why do bodily mutilation and the cutting and the slicing involved in gender reassignment and gender horror and anxiety in so many people? What unconscious fears of the grotesque are triggered by the hermaphrodite, evoked by the transsexual, as such a figure becomes mainstreamed in our American civilization? Well, let's find out. I'm Jason Hill, and this is The Jason Hill Show. Men are becoming increasingly ambivalent about their penises in the United States of America. Some have a guilty and a very resentful attitude towards it. Fewer and fewer straight men are having sex, according to the reports I mentioned. And biological males identifying as trans women are chopping off their penises at an alarming rate, a phenomenon known as transitioning. The radical new wave of fashionably accessorizing to a dangerous and all-pervasive idea pathogen called trans ideology is going to kill off American civilization much faster than the imminent threat of Marxist ideology and looming socialism taking place and taking root in our society. Socialism, at least, keeps men alive. Trans ideology is the obliteration of masculinity, manliness, manhood, and biological men. It is the most nihilistic idea pathogen infecting society today. Why? Because it and a plethora of radical, man-hating left-wing cohorts that comprise sundry man-hating institutions and communities have criminalized the male penis. They have indicted the penis as an instrument of rape, oppression, and dominance, which it probably ought to be, and they are creating a generation of young men who see their penises as birth defects, a source of their original sinfulness as members of the male sex. To criminalize the male penis is misanthropic. The penis is often reduced as an extractant of sperm by man-haters left to waddle in a petri dish, whose sprouters are regarded as dispensable role players in the continuation of the human species. Now, I fear that those who wish to crush it simultaneously fear and loathe humanity. They will not nuclearize the world apocalyptically. They will fell it by rendering the penis impotent and the men who possess it lacking in virility. And here we must remember that virility in the classic sense, has to do with strength, courage, and vigor. These are all masculine moral virtues. As more men identify as non-binary or as trans women, their penises become flaccid and useless appendages incapable of forceful penetration because they have been colonized and have succumbed to the gynocentric feminist paradigm that, well, sees penile thrusting as just bad. The act is believed to be nothing more than primal imperial dominance over women. And as an increasing number of biological women who identify as trans men increase, I think we will see a growing swamp of unused vaginas that exhibit a, quote, no entrance sign to the male penis on one account. And in the other scenario such, women who transition into their chosen assigned male gender are grafted with a makeshift penis. It is limp. It can never become erect, ejaculate sperm, so it lacks procreative fecundity. It is an artificial assemblage of fatty tissue that gives such individuals the feeling of maleness, although a permanently impotent one. Now, in both scenarios, the penis has been annihilated, lambasted, impugned, ignored, criminalized, and amputated by biological men identifying as women, And the penis has been banished into a shameful wasteland. Straight men are having less sex, I believe, because the emasculating culture generated by the ball-busting, gynocentric radicals do not engender confidence regarding their masculinity. Every real man's sexual esteem, sexual self-esteem, is tied to the possession of a penis and to its ability to lift him up in triumph and for a brief moment achieve in minutes or the sexual heroic hours of glory in its exalted performance. A trans woman is the most sorrowful of sexual personae one can possibly imagine, for he or she has donned the insignia of permanent impotence in living as a diminished male. I think such a person carries a lifeless bulge in their trousers that is unable to stir, to shift, and rise. It's pure deadweight. And deadweight is the correct moniker because whether the prosthesis is a makeshift penis or a fake vagina, none of its bearers will ever experience sexual pleasure. Now, despite the continued progress that progressive schools, or we can just say the progressive strides made in schools and universities, and the larger culture continues to make regarding transgendered people, we are told that the United States still remains a country that is largely transphobic and inhospitable to the needs of trans persons. This indictment exists against the backdrop of a culture where people are summarily dismissed from their jobs for not using gender-neutral pronouns to refer to the ever-shifting non-binary and fluid identities of trans persons who often demand to be referred to a plethora of non-binary new pronouns depending on how they might feel at any given moment. The accusation exists in a milieu where trans philosophies are widely promoted in university curriculars across America, and where trans men are applying for abortion rights and medical benefits dispensed by Planned Parenthood. Now, a large segment of our population is skeptical, not amused, and just not willing to critically accept the dictates of an ideology to which they're expected to acquiesce, especially as is the case in some K through 12 schools where teachers are telling parents not to gender their children as they will not be gendering them in the classroom. Or in those far from amusing cases during drag queen reading hour, where drag queens are seen reading stories to little children, and in one instance is heard telling a little boy sitting on his lap, you know, when you grow up, you too can be a drag queen. Since we all know that drag queens, who are men dressed up as women, are a staple of gay clubs and belong in gay clubs, their motives in regard to these young children, and especially impressionable young boys, are obvious. Now, if such is the case, then there is a moral, psychological explanation for such public skepticism that simply cannot be reduced to bigotry. In the broadest and most fundamental of terms, transgenderism and its medical administrations constitute a form of medical, social, and cultural eugenics. Short of cloning another human being, the attempt to change one's sex, a biological impossibility, is the most audacious eugenical act undertaken in human history. Now, to be factual here, gender dysphoria involves a deep conflict between a person's physical or assigned gender, that is the biological sex, determined by the chromosomal markers that determine their sex at birth, XX for females and XY for males, and the gender with which they identify. So persons with gender dysphoria often feel they were born in the wrong body, They feel conflicted with the gender roles they are expected to conform to, and are deeply uncomfortable with the anatomical sex body parts that are coterminous with their biological sex. Now, one should say from the start that the feeling of pain and suffering such individuals experience are real. They are real, and that they should never be eviscerated of their dignity, nor evicted from the domain of the ethical, the pantheon of the human community, or the realm of individual rights. They are human beings like everybody else, and they deserve equal protection as individuals, not as special groups, under the law. Now, such persons are often referred to and identified as transgendered individuals. Other terms that used to be used by society and said individuals are transvestites and transsexuals, and the latter often being reserved for transgendered persons who have undergone complete gender reassignment surgeries. In the case of a trans woman who has transitioned completely, this involves amputation of the penis and scrotum, testicles, and the creation of an artificial vagina, along with the construction of female breasts and the intake of hormonal treatments to transfigure the male body into one that is indistinguishable from that of a female's body. Similarly, trans men who are biological females who undergo such a surgical procedure often, more often than not, elect to have a double mastectomy, transfigure their vaginas in a manner that allows for the construction of a male penis, and are the recipients of hormonal treatments that render the body a prototype of the male body, replete in many cases with facial hair, increased musculature, and other physical markers that carve out the transformed female body as distinctly male. Now, recently, as stated, our culture has come under attack by a significant segment of the trans community for society as being transphobic. They include those who refuse to address transgendered persons under the grammatically incorrect moniker of, quote, they, or refer to a person who identifies with neither the male or female pronouns of he or she, but who opts for self-referential neologisms such as Z or XE. Now, under new legislation, persons born in New York, Hawaii, Oregon, California, Washington, and New Jersey may now choose a non-binary gender marker X on their birth certificate. And the legislation will discontinue the need for a doctor's note or healthcare provider's affidavit to change one's gender marker. If such is the case, then there is a moral, psychological explanation for public skepticism that simply cannot be reduced to bigotry. In the broadest and most fundamental of terms, transgenderism and its medical administrations constitute, I think, a radical form of social and cultural eugenics. Short of cloning another human being, the attempt to change one's sex, which is a biological impossibility, as I've said, is the most audacious eugenical act undertaken in human history. It takes a biological given, the chromosomal markers of a person that designate his or her sex and gender, and attempts to reverse, alter, and neutralize it. It is a revolt against an invariable law of nature, the law of identity. Now, the law of identity states that a thing is what it is, that it is determined by its essence, which is determined by constitutive fundamental characteristics that make it the thing that it is, and that it cannot be other than what it is. A thing can only become what it already is in essence. In other words, as Aristotle would say, A is A. A equals A. The way this radical form of eugenics manifests itself and attempts to reverse the law of identity is by way of taking a very rare medical condition and normalizing it. This medical condition caused by a DNA disorder gives birth to the hermaphrodite. It is extremely rare in humans, constituting, according to various statistics, about 0.5 to 1% of all live births in the total world population. It is a condition in which a single human being can possess both male and female reproductive organs inside and outside of the body. In every stage of human history, the birth of the hermaphrodite has been met with absolute horror and metaphysical incredulity. The condition was regarded as a bad omen presaging war, disaster, or pestilence. The infant was usually destroyed or left to exposure, and blame was usually assigned to the parents for being guilty of some irredeemable moral malfeasance. Now, today's trans woman with her intact penis, those who haven't transformed, with her intact penis, testicles, and bulging cleavage, is a symbol of a eugenically crafted hermaphrodite, a strange primeval androgyne that conjures up in the minds of many images of a futuristic phenomenon that attempts to function and becomes a realistic model for human life, while remaining in nature something of a metaphysical grotesquerie, a small percentage of aberrant birth defects nature has spared most parents. The transgender person not only normalizes and legitimizes the figure of the hermaphrodite, but also those who go through the completion process become castrated eunuchs, cold, abstract androids in the public consciousness. In the minds of many, what is a medical rarity in nature becomes transmogrified via a surgical procedure into a self-cutting figure who elicits myriad unconscious fears, right? Castration anxiety, self-mutilation, and traversing gender, which means going beyond the creation of life itself. In the public imagination, the trans person represents a closed system that shuts down all reproductive life in ways not necessarily analogous to the lives of gays and lesbians. Gays and lesbians can still reproduce if they choose. Hipster transgenderism is seen by many TERFs, that is, trans-exclusionary radical feminists, as sex appropriation. Now, both iterations of the transgendered individual are an assault against masculinity. In the case of the trans woman, it is complete obliteration of masculinity. Such a person dons woman's glamour and outward exterior while still retaining the brain and mind of a man. And for many women, this is regarded as unspeakable appropriation of what nature has rightfully bequeathed to them. For most heterosexual men, it is maddeningly disorienting. Why? Because it pits their own sense of what is naturally sexually attractive to them, a real biological woman, against what is often their own worst nightmare, a trans woman who looks womanlier than any biological woman they know, but who is still biologically male. She passes, and they're attracted to her. They know that in the end, they're still attracted to a biological female, and that they're coupling with the hierarchical mind of a man, one of their own kind. Female to male transitions involve, in some sense, what we can call an aesthetic slumming down. A woman loses her feminine power, her glamour, and capacity to enthrall men. Now, if you observe, most of those women who do transition to men end up looking like diminutive men. Most women who become trans men undercut their female beauty and in becoming men appear less attractive. And the truth is that most ordinary, average, common-looking women can transform themselves instantly with a little bit of makeup, a pair of high heels, and earrings, and erotic dress wear. So women become women by menstruating and gain their sexual ethical identity when they become mothers and fulfill their moral responsibilities of all that is involved in child rearing. Trans men, biological women who act and dress like men, possess little, if any, of the authentic, primal, and brutish power of the masculine male. No amount of managed behavior can obliterate the female hormonal element that begins the life form of every fetus. Because we must remember that every fetus remains female unless it is steeped in male hormones produced by signal from the testes. Therefore, the trans man's biological female attempts at manliness is always mediated by the imprimatur of the female biological template she was stamped with in utero, and that condemns her to always looking like anything but a real man. And this is one of the reasons why girly men are more convincing and more passable as authentic females than our butch trans men. It's because girly men, that is, trans women, began as females and got stuck in that template in some arrested manner. The trans man is woman inherent, trying to forge manhood via cosmetic means, which is a hopelessly and futile undertaking. Few can exhibit the erectile potency of the biological male or his phallic grandeur without enormous medical intervention. Their penis can never ejaculate sperm and can never impregnate a woman, nor can their penis, even a transplanted one, preserve nerve endings that will be as responsive to tactile sensation as an authentic male penis. Now, similarly, a trans woman's vagina possesses none of its bearers with its more than 8,000 erogenous nerve endings found in the clitoris that give rise to a female orgasm. Nor can a trans vagina accommodate a very large penis. Though the trans woman, often in some cases a very effeminate gay man, may fantasize about a big penis, it is her worst sexual nightmare. It hurts like hell to be inside of her. The trans woman can never bear children or inhabit the psychological interiority of woman's emotional, multifaceted nature. And the very notion of gender fluidity destabilizes primal masculinity, which does not conceive of itself as illusory, fluid, and existing in some indeterminate flux. So the assault against masculinity and the attempt to reverse the law of identity have deeper implications. Trans literally means beyond, operating across boundaries. To go beyond gender is for many people cognitively untenable. The trans individual who identifies as X or they is a neutered abstraction. It defies categorization and has turned itself into an object. The goal of those who identify as X is not to become male or female, but either to eradicate gender, sex altogether, which is a biological impossibility, or to create a fluid, non-binary something beyond any kind of conceptual placeholder. Let's take a short break here, and when we come back, I want to connect transgenderism with a phenomenon called transhumanism and say a bit more about why I believe transgender ideology promotes sexual eugenics. Why I believe that. You're listening to The Jason Hill Show, and I am Jason Hill. Welcome back to the show. I'm Jason Hill, and this is The Jason Hill Show. On the one hand, we can say that trans ideology is dedicated to transhumanism. This is the idea that through technology and scientific manipulation, human nature is still a work in progress and can be improved upon. Now, before going on to define transhumanism and its relation to the post-human and transgenderism and the obliteration of all gender, most of all the male gender, let us bear this in mind. One of the incontrovertible ways in which we make sense of ourselves as human beings is via the assignation of a biological sex by nature. And to go beyond this assignation is to evacuate the self of a metaphysical insignia that allows us to make ourselves intelligible and render us incomprehensible and morally incoherent. Since, as I shall argue later, our sexual identities have a normative, ethical feature to them. Now, transgenderism is a form of sexual eugenics that ushers in the idea of the post-human or the transhuman. So philosopher Nick Bostrom, head of the Oxford Future of Humanity Institute, he wrote the following of transhumanism. Quote, he says, "Transhumanism is a loosely defined movement that has developed gradually over the past 2 decades. It promotes an interdisciplinary approach to understanding and evaluating the opportunities for enhancing the human condition and the human organism opened up by the achievement of technology. Attention is given to both present technologies like genetic engineering and information technology, and anticipated future ones such as molecular nanotechnology and artificial intelligence. Transhumanists view human nature as a work in progress, a half-baked beginning that we can learn to remold in different ways. Current humanity need not be the endpoint of human evolution. Transhumanists hope that by responsible use of science, technology, and other rational means, we shall eventually manage to become post-human, beings with vastly greater capacities than present human beings have." Close quote. So for gender and trans ideologists, transhumanism is an escapist utopian fantasy where they can live a sort of soft life devoid of robust and ethical expectation derived from their sex identities. If you're a man, you become a man when other men say you are a man. And in the larger world hemisphere, by having sex with a woman. If you are a man, you are called upon to lead, to be strong, to leave a legacy of some kind, to become a problem solver, and to protect others. And since masculinity must be consciously constructed, it is the more ethical of the two gendered identities, I think. Primal masculinity is the exaltation of pure, unadulterated vitality. It is the virile expression of strength without any restraint, control, or critical vigilance over it. Manhood involves playing a role that has an ethical dimension to it. Let me get to there in a little while. So, a friend of mine said that those non-binary males walking around with polished nails and wearing unisex attire are often cop-outs who wish to escape the duties and responsibilities that come with becoming and being a man. And in sharing this philosophy of transhuman transgenderism, this person said that such persons are trying to escape into a world of what they called gender unemployment. So the rapid increase of now claiming to be transgendered and non-binary, a phenomenon that has more than doubled in the last 2 years, is indicative that it is a fad. And those who are faddishly transgendered or non-binary are applying loudly at the gender unemployment office. Now, this is because, as I've said, and we'll speak to, gender identities have certain ethical roles fixed to them, and many are recusing themselves from the ethical responsibilities these roles commit them to. So, to live beyond gender and sex identity, to be indefinitely fluid, is to commit to nothing. One is a metaphysical rebel par excellence. One's drift is to be nothing. The fashionable gender benders are individuals who suffer the most among any other group over the agony of being born. They are on a historical mission to recuse themselves from the biological order and to not become transhuman, but rather to revert to a state of non-humanity. It is a historical mission that is a negation of the human condition. They want to sleep their way through history by being a they, a sort of pluralistic conglomeration of nothingness. What the left is trying to accomplish is to recuse and expel men from the historical process, prevent them from being epoch-making agents. They wish to cancel their manliness like an aborted embryo. Butchery is their modus operandi, indeed, of all life forms, from the growing fetus to the chronological stages one must pass through in order to have a robust, gendered life. Faddish gender rebels are like an aborted fetus with its pitiful stump raised to the sky in a desperate attempt to be embraced by a sort of nameless universe with red froth dripping from its mouth as it screams in guttural terror at an indifferent universe that has dared to name it, sex it without its permission, thereby stamping it with a biological insignia it had not chosen. In cancelling the scientific fact of biological sex and its correlative gender identity, the accessorizing, applying for gender unemployment trans person articulates what the self-aborted fetus can only moan and groan about, which is an angry and delirious rage at society for misplacing and sanctioning, respectively, the misplacement of one's mind and soul in the wrong body. The declared eugenics behind transhuman, trans, and gender ideology is also meant to re-socialize boys by, I think, homosexualizing them. So let's take the delusional idea floating around that men can get pregnant and menstruate, which is an unscientific notion that is unchallenged by so many. Now, as I like to remind those who utter such conceptual inanities, we're talking about trans men who are biological females with XX chromosomal markers, intact female anatomy, which includes their reproductive apparatus. The idea that a man can get pregnant and carry a child is deeply emasculating to a young male child. And the spread of this idea ought to be considered child abuse. It means, in effect, that a heterosexual boy is bludgeoned with the idea that he can impregnate another man. Now, a young boy growing up gauges his burgeoning masculinity and the fecundity of his sexual self-esteem against the potency he carries in his evolving scrotum. It is a relational association he carries on with a biological female, speaking in the heterosexual frame of reference here. But as he's told in his corrupt K-12 government school by nefarious woke teachers that men can get pregnant, as he's told this, he begins to wonder if when he is grown up, he too can get pregnant. If his best friend Ian can get pregnant, whom should he have sex with as an adult? Men who he's told can get pregnant, or the biological girls he finds beautiful and to whom he's attracted? But as I said before, every heterosexual male ratifies his masculinity by an appeal to his procreative potency. If trans men are real men, and Ian his best friend is a real boy, and men can get pregnant, and so can women, what the hell? If he can sire a future child by impregnating a man, does this make him gay? As he grows older and trans ideology sinks its tentacles deeper inside his psyche and permeates the cultural imagination, how does this primal polarity between the sexes that reconcile itself through vaginal coitus and procreation gets reconciled in heterosexual males who are socialized to believe men can have babies? What monstrously grotesque distortion of a child's perceptive faculties is forged when he perceives that it is only biological women who can get pregnant, and that a trans man is a woman in disguise, but that he's forced to capitulate to cultural psychosis and call her a man. We're going to take another short break here, and when we get back, we'll get to the ethicality of manhood. I'm Jason Hill, and you are listening to The Jason Hill Show. To look is to be able to perceive, identify, and name, which allows one to classify and to eventually conceptualize. To conceptualize is to engage in the highest form of cognition known to human beings. To classify oneself as an X or a they is not just to render oneself a synthetic phenomenon. It extinguishes any category of intelligible human identity known to man. An X does not correspond to any known biological genotype. Such individuals, therefore, evicting themselves from the realm of the intelligible human domain and from all classificatory schemata, are unfortunate. Logically speaking, they constitute an empty set. And I think this evokes annihilation anxiety in many, to the extent that the categorization of oneself as an X has a moral upshot to it. For a great many individuals, the trans movement seems to have sprung out of nowhere. Or more precisely, let me say, its ideology and activist agenda seems to have taken hold of the public's moral imagination before the public had time to debate and grapple with what it perceives as the ethically vexed premises within the ideology and the lived reality of the trans experience. The truth is that the moral grammar of all emancipatory movements in our lifetime, or those within our historical consciousness, has always been up for grabs and subjected to moral debate. Institutions and movements such as chattel slavery, the suffragette movement, women's liberation, the feminist movement, the civil rights movement, abortion rights for women, the gay and lesbian rights movement, which culminated in marital equality for gays and lesbians, all had protracted histories with an often dissenting public. But through a dialogical and democratic procedure, several sides were able to issue arguments, contestations, and rejoinders. What emerged was a sometimes reluctant, transformative era of tolerance and acceptance. We witnessed the organic moral transformation of public consciousness over time. The ownership of one's body and its moral corollaries, the right to privacy and the right to autonomy, have superseded all discussions regarding ethical duties one may have to oneself, such as the right not to mutilate one's body in the manner executed during surgical procedures in transforming one's, quote, wrongly assigned gendered body. Just as important from an ethical perspective is allowing young adolescents to undergo medical treatments that include taking prescription drugs known as puberty blockers, irreversible cross-sex hormones that lead to permanent bodily impairment, and so-called sex reassignment surgery. The side effects of these drugs, such as Lupron, are very, very serious. They range from suicidal ideation to severe osteoporosis, debilitating joint pain, compromised immune systems, and severe depression. And what about our new era in which parents are urged to burden their 4-year-old child with the task of deciding to elect what gender he or she is? Is it any wonder several rational persons regard this enormous responsibility placed on a cognitively immature human being as an egregious form of child abuse? When children are being taught in school today that men can now give birth and that such men ought to have access to abortion rights, most Americans will have need for moral reflection. And although such a person may look like a man, replete with bulging muscles, a beard, and a flat chest, and may feel like a man, act like a man, believe himself to be a man, let us right here, with scientific precision, say that such an individual is a biological woman, and for the rest of her life will be a biological woman. It is just not possible to change one's sex. The duplicitous effrontery of trans philosophy will be deciphered and critically appraised by most rational people. Individuals ought to do so, of course, while remaining sympathetic to the suffering of those very small percentage of persons who do literally suffer from gender dysphoria, versus, as I mentioned, the growing swath of folks who are now identifying as such. So transgender ideology is an idea pathogen, the new form of rebellion, a sort of giving of the finger to a society, a new way of bucking convention and defying authority. But it is mostly a way of recusing oneself from the moral responsibilities that come with their sex and their attendant roles. Fewer boys, it seems, want to fix things and solve problems with their hands, and fewer girls think motherhood and being the keeper of the family are good acts. So let me read some passages from a revolutionary book that just came out called No Apologies: Why Civilization Depends on the Strength of Men by Anthony Esolen, which speaks to the moral dimension of manhood. I'm going to read a few passages for you, which speaks to the ethicality of manhood. Dr. Esolen says, the colonial pipeline was invented, created, and maintained by men with the technical skill to do so. Whatever we say about its invention creation, though all of human history testifies to the boundlessly creative power of mechanically minded men, certainly the maintenance had to be that way. Women were not going to do it then, and with an occasional outlier here or there, women are not going to do it now. If you call a plumber to deal with a sewer pipe that has backed up in your basement, it is a practical certainty that it is going to be a man, because the sheer strength required to deal with the valve rusted shut, or with a section of pipe that has to be cut or muscled into place, is like a threshold. If you cannot reach the threshold, and if you're a teenage boy or an old man, you are likely to fail. You cannot do that job. You cannot, as our women soldiers apparently do, ask the men next to you to give you a hand. All kinds of tasks involve such thresholds. Dr. Esolen goes on to say, speaking of ethicality of manhood, we see that there's a way to look at the male-only institutions of the past as neither invidious nor oppressive of women, but as a natural expression of the masculine imperative. Men labor and fight and strive so that there may be decent homes in villages and cities, so that there may be feasts and religious celebrations, so that children will grow up healthy and sane, and the next generation will be able to provide for the well-being of the people in the future. We are perhaps deceived by the historians' predictable and understandable focus on wars and migrations, and discoveries into overlooking the fact that even in a military empire such as Rome, most people at most times and places are engaged in the affairs of an orderly and ordinary life. You are a woman living in Florence in 1600. It is November and you're wearing a woolen coat to keep yourself warm. The wool for your coat came from sheep in England. It was sent in raw from Flanders, where it was worked into cloth, and not for the fun of it, for money. The gold and silver ore, because you need something that is both stable and valuable everywhere to serve for currency, had to be gotten from the earth by men going down the mines. It had to be tried by fire and purified in a foundry. It had to be transported by ship or by overland caravans. It had to be punched into coins, all to allow that woolen cloth to be brought from Flanders to Florence to be dyed in trade for money. The dyes must also be manufactured. And the Florentines do not dye cloth for the fun of it either. Most of that now fully finished cloth will be traded for spices and drugs and other goods from the East, overland or by ship. Who builds the ships? Who hews the timber for the masts and the planks? Who sails the ships? Who protects them from privateers? What is it all for? Would men do these things for themselves? Men would rather live hand to mouth out in the wild. The miracle of culture and of civilization is the miracle of the transformation and redirection of masculine energy from the willful self to the team, the work crew, the school, and the army, for the sake of the home and the women at the center of the home, and in the end, for the sake of the city and the nation. But this miracle does not occur unless it springs from and fulfills certain passions in the boy and the man. You do not make teams happen just by persuading men that it would be useful to have them. You have them because men enjoy them. They are attracted to them. They build men's muscles, train their wills, and sharpen their minds. We will take another short break, and when we return, we'll talk about, among other things, an actual trans person whom I regard as a liar and a cheat, a massive 6'1" biological man who identifies as a woman, an athlete bashing and crushing female swimmers in the pool in a manner worse than a barracuda let loose could have had the sadistic pleasure of doing. I think many of you know of whom I speak. I'll be right back. I'm Jason Hill, and you're listening to The Jason Hill Show. Welcome back to the show. Trans individuals are metaphysical rebels who live in a eugenicized, artificially constructed world that is both make-believe and real. As I've said, the rebellion is one against the law of identity, which is an axiom and an invariable law of nature, as unalterable as the law of gravity. One's biological sex can never be changed, regardless of wishes, desires, protestations, abysmal screams at the universe, prayers, or simple despair. From the perspective, however, that reality is not objective, but rather that there is a significant dimension of it that is socially constructed, then their rebellion is real. Trans individuals have remade and reinvented themselves and foisted newly fashionable or refashioned beings upon the world. As mentioned before, short of cloning a human being, the phenomenon of mainstreaming the hermaphrodite and the increased cases of gender reassignment surgeries may be the closest application of artificial intelligence to the human body inserted in the public sphere. It is a myth, of course, because biological sex cannot be reversed. But human beings are myth-making creatures. Simultaneously, society will need to live with individuals whose actions and decisions seem as if they could only emanate from a god or from nature. In the end, people can choose to live in opposition to the invariability of the laws of nature and cull conceptions of the good lives for themselves. The consequences of such choices are theirs to bear, and if they find peace and happiness in such choices, and if nature's laws are invariable, then the verdict regarding the sustainability and longevity and authenticity of that peace and happiness will still be out, and reality, not society, will be the final arbiter. That in just the last few years, gender dysphoria has gone from an extremely rare phenomenon to a stratospherically high syndrome among young men and women should be alarming for several reasons. The first is that rather than treat it as a fad and an adolescent phase, adults who are supposed to be mature and long range in their thinking have taken the judgments of children about their sexual identities at a time when their brains are still underdeveloped as final. We both infantilize children into adulthood, but also make them into mini-adults in the name of some false sense of premature autonomy and sovereignty and jurisdiction, which young people just cannot possibly exercise over their bodies. Folks, we do not allow them to drink before the age of 21 or vote before the age of 18. But we will permit girls at 14 or 15 to elect to have a double mastectomy and partake in puberty blockers. And all this psychotic malarkey is endorsed by the state. In some cases, a parent can be indicted, arrested for not attesting to the child's desires. I want to end with an open letter to Leah Thomas, the biological trans athlete who identifies as trans and has been competing on the University of Pennsylvania's swim team and using his advantage as a biological male to crush, just crush these poor women who have worked so hard in training, some to keep their scholarship, just crush them in swimming competition. As I said, this guy is 6'1", looks and is built like a linebacker. And it is just part of the psychosis of today's culture that he can just decide to identify as a trans woman and be allowed to compete with biological females. He competed on the university's men's swim team from 2017 to 2020 and on its women's swim team from 2021 to 2022. In March of 2022, Thomas became the first openly transgender athlete to win an NCAA Division I national championship in any sport after winning the women's 500-yard freestyle event. In June of 2022, the International Swimming Federation, FINA, an organization that administers international aquatic sports competitions, voted to bar all transgender athletes from competing in professional women's swimming, with the exception of athletes who can establish to FINA's comfortable satisfaction that they have not experienced any part of male puberty beyond Tanner stage 2 of puberty or before age 12, which is later. barring Thomas from competing in the women's competition at the 2024 Paris Olympics as she had planned. Now, in response to this decision, Thomas said the new FINA release is deeply upsetting. It is discriminatory and will only serve to harm all women. Yeah, Leo, real women. Women with XX chromosomal markers who do not have a penis. That would not be you. In July of 2022, the University of Pennsylvania nominated Thomas for the 2022 NCAA Woman of the Year Award, one out of 577 athletes nominated for this award. So here's what I want to say to Leah Thomas. Leah, you were born a biological male. You have XY chromosomes that irrevocably designate your sex as male. You began to identify as either non-binary or female around 2 years ago. You are currently a member of the University of Pennsylvania's women's swim team, where you recently were victorious against Cornell University's women's team. As a trans woman with the physical advantages of still being a biological male, you have broken several of the University of Pennsylvania's women's swim record. In your 1650 meter freestyle win, you beat second place finisher and teammate Anna Kalanzi by 38 seconds. Because of you, women such as Kalandadze, who held records, no longer hold them. You, as a biological male, have unfairly stripped them of their hard-fought honors. Now, according to the National Collegiate Athletic Association, the NCAA, it is permissible for biological women to compete in women's sport. A man simply has to announce that he's a woman and take testosterone suppressors for a year. Now, here are some facts, Leo. One of the advantages you still carry, regardless of your testosterone levels, is that a person who was born male, you have certain innate physical advantages over women. You are stronger, you are faster, you have larger lungs, a larger heart, and a larger skeletal size. You enjoy greater circulation, and you possess less fat than biological women. I cannot understand the deeply misogynistic attitude evinced by the NCAA, nor can I fathom the way our nation, for the most part, stands by and watches while mass psychosis subsumes reality. As a professionally trained ethicist who is also a cisgender gay man, I respect your individual right to self-identify and to call a conception of the good life for yourself around your gender identity. You have a right to be treated with dignity and respect, and no one should ever violate your bodily integrity. Your decision to view yourself as a woman should never permit others to eviscerate you of your individual rights as a human being, but I also advocate individual rights of women. Your freedom to call such a life stops when you foist that identity as an unassailable truth onto others and force them to adopt it as a normative mandate. You and the cowardly NCAA are guilty of wholesale cheating on a massive scale. Biological men competing with women is a form of massive cheating. There are rules that create different sporting categories for men and women based on objective criteria found in nature and reality. You swam on a men's team and you competed with men. You know very well what those differences are. My sense is that even though you came out as transgendered, that disclosure gave you no right to decide as a biological man to compete with real biological women. You are not a biological woman, and you will never be one. That is an objective reality. Accept it. There is one first irreducible and fundamental criterion for determining membership on college athletic teams. It is biological sex, not gender identity. To ignore this is to act as if your wishes, pleas, fantasies, will, and desires can supersede and replace reality. When institutions in the sporting world and in higher education act as mindless supplicants to magical and wishful thinking, what we have are tragic consequences, manufactured psychosis, and a maddeningly constructed reality in which facts are treated as if they were opinions. You use your very masculine body to subvert the law of identity or the law of non-contradiction, which states that a thing is what it is and can be nothing else. Water cannot freeze and boil at the same time, Leo, and a stone cannot be a stone and a feather. A biological male cannot be a male and a woman at the same time. Rhetorical plinth and semantic pretzel maneuverings cannot alter reality. You are an institutional cheater, and a fortiori a liar, not just because you evade reality, but because you willfully chose to evade reality. You have robbed and will continue to rob many desperate and financially strapped young women of their athletic scholarships. These are women you bludgeon in the pool with your male strength and privilege, while you refer to yourself as a she or female. These women do not stand any chance against you. This is because you are performing fundamentally as a male athlete against female athletes. The same people who prate against patriarchy and male privilege have created an immoral infrastructure for you to cheat your way through swim meets, while the world looks on with incredulity, but in abject silence. There are exceptions. Cynthia Millen, a U.S. swimming official who officiated meets for over 3 decades, heroically resigned in December of 2021, I believe, in protest of your membership on the women's swim team. She has stated that she cannot stand by and watch as girls are thrown under the bus by biological male competitors. Admitting that men are faster and different from women, she accused you of destroying women's swimming. Yay for Cynthia Millen for standing up to injustice. Our age is morally bankrupt. It is marred by ethical relativism, which holds that each culture is the sovereign author of its own ethical precepts, rules, and principles. There does not exist any universal criteria that can adjudicate among competing truth claims within and outside of culture. Truth claims are language games created by the powerful with a built-in grammar of oppression that seeks to entangle and silence the oppressed in their acts of resistance. Subjective personal opinions are qualitatively equal to well-thought-out rational explanations backed by reason, logic, empirical evidence. And reason and logic are white, racist European constructs. Those are some of the norms of today. You use your very masculine body and your agency to ratify the canards of this philosophy. Your voluntary membership on the female swim team is proof that despite knowing the truth, you engage in a lie. And that lie allows you to cheat with impunity. My sense is that on a men's team, you would not be anything special. You'd be average and ordinary. Certainly not the athletic star you are today. You're a star because you coveted fame and glory at the shameful expense of women who are physically weaker and less advantaged than you are. The whole world knows this. Yet, the silent majority says nothing. It says nothing because it has been in thralls of gender eugenics, of which you are both a creator and a participant. Gender eugenics is the ideology that seeks to re-socialize the moral sensibilities of Americans towards a new understanding of gender and biological sex as social constructs. Gender and biological sex, according to this ideology, are to be viewed as phenomena artificially identified in a nefarious biological taxonomy, replete with dubious criteria that attempt to designate sex. The whole taxonomy itself is biased and suffused with gendered interpretations. Americans, the ideology maintains, must learn to reorient themselves to understanding that both gender and biological sex are strategic fictions created by a white, heteronormative, patriarchal culture. They must see gender and sex identity as naturally existing on a continuum. The attempts by parents to force their children to identify with one of the two binary sex categories of male and female are seen as a form of child abuse because binary identification is regarded as unnatural. Gender eugenics, Leah, mainstreams institutional cheating and lying because it convinces persons that biological sex is malleable and mutable when it most emphatically is not. To date, no scientist has found a way to alter, modify, or change a person's sex. That is, to change the chromosomal markers that determine biological sex. Against the backdrop, Leo, of a culture that increasingly treats facts as mere opinions, a culture in which people lose their jobs for stating the demonstrable fact that men cannot give birth to children, gender eugenics tries to invalidate our knowledge of the truth. Leah Thomas, Leah, in achieving the eugenical moment, you upset the moral grammar that governs not just thought, but our very method of cognition. Every time you compete with women, you normalize a patina of psychotic thought permeating our society, that biological men can be thought of as becoming and being as real as biological women. Your eugenical moment is achieved when you and others act as if desires and wishful thinking can trump reality by a simple process, the inversion of reality. In other words, by your behavior, Leo, you demonstrate that you believe that the purpose of consciousness is not to perceive reality correctly and act accordingly based on facts. Rather, the purpose of consciousness is to create reality, to make it up, based on the primacy of your will, your fantasies, your desires, your intentions, your emotional cravings. So many people have capitulated to the psychosis you advance because they are weak and cannot bear to face reality. If you can make your own reality and live comfortably in it, then they will grant you your desires and let you get away with a deceptive facsimile of the reality you advance as real. At some point in their lives, however, their subjective recreation of reality will require endorsement and ratification, since everyone will believe that no one else's perceptive skills, judgments, and truthful conclusions are better than anyone else's. By what right will anyone challenge or question their fabricated reality that they can have ratified by institutions and codified into law? You see, Leo, the gender eugenics movement allows people to operate on the lowest cognitive level because society does not hold them accountable for the distortions, the perversions that arise from acting as if laws of nature can be twisted like a piece of putty to fit anyone's private evasions or construct a subjective reality that behaves with the same invariability as do laws of nature. Leah, do you see the civilizational harm you cause? In the competitions, while you perform as a liar and a cheat, you behave like a bully. You pick on women weaker and less advantaged than you by virtue of their sex, and that's what bullies do. In predatory fashion, they single out a person or group that is constitutionally disadvantaged. Bullies never pick on their equals. You have every right to classify yourself as you wish. There should be no arbitrary obstructions placed by the state to interfere with your efforts. But trans rights are not human rights, if we mean by trans rights the right of biological men to compete in sporting events with biological women. Trans rights are not human rights if we believe every trans person is entitled to government funds that allow them to modify, remove, or create new genitalia in what is known as the transformation process. The state has no right making such a process illegal but such persons cannot force the state or others to change a scientific assignation based on any artificial surgical procedure and the hormonal treatments preceding and following it. Endless testosterone suppressing treatments cannot alter your biological makeup. They will just make you have low testosterone levels. Leah, in the name of decency and in the name of a return to morality, you should resign from the Pennsylvania University women's swim team. You do not belong there, and you know it. End your cheating presence among these women and give them a chance to have their aspirational identities realized. Moral courage demands that you apologize to the women you unfairly clobber by exercising your male privilege when you entangle them in the pool as a competitor. Life is a series of possibilities and disclosures. It also consists in foreclosures and limitations. Maturity consists in knowing when to stay in our lane and when to leap from it and eat the sky like an apple. I'm sure the world you desire for yourself can be won, but do not achieve it by cheating others of a chance of achieving their world fairly. Be who you think you are, but do not impose your interpretation of yourself on others by force. And do not expect the silent majority to watch as you and the colluding phalanx of individuals who support you think that by sleight of hand, forging semantic chicanery, you can cheat, fake, and evade reality. You may do so, but you cannot long avoid facing the consequences of faking reality. Reality will eventually catch up with who you really are.